You are codependent. I'm sorry. I know that's not easy to hear, but it's the truth. And I'd rather you knew now than waiting until you feel you have no way out. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. My guest today is Sarah Michaud. Dr. Michaud knows codependency better than anyone, having lived it, lived with it, and worked against it. She's joining us today to unshroud this insidious trait and the ways in which we are all affected by it. She's also a listener of the show, and I'd love to hear from more listeners like her. If you want to come on the show and share your favorite niche, just email dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com. Let's break free. Welcome to the show, Sarah Michaud.
Hi, thanks, Colton. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Okay. My name is Dr. Sarah Michaud, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I live in Massachusetts, and I specialize in addiction, recovery, and codependency.
Nice. And what got you working, interested in psychology in general?
It's an interesting question. I think sometimes it's because if you grow up in kind of insanity or unpredictable environments, which many of us do, we become fascinated with the human condition. And I've just always been really interested in people. And in college, I started my major in sociology. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do with a sociology degree? So someone said, well, start taking some psychology classes. And by then, I had gotten sober from alcohol and drugs. I was 24 years old when I got sober, which is pretty young. So I think I just became, got on this journey of self-exploration. And now I'm just fascinated with human beings. And I think the older I get, it's funny, my son and I were talking about it last night because he's 22 and I think he's starting to see how people are and that everybody's got issues, basically. I mean, we've all got something, right? Nobody gets out of this thing without having some issues. So, yeah, I'm just fascinated.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, you literally wrote the book on codependency. What drove that, specifically?
Yeah. All right. So this is the thing with the book is I think what happened is, so I was someone in recovery. I had, by the time I started thinking about the book, I was probably close to 20 years sobriety. I was married to someone who was also in recovery. And so at that time, I'm seeing 30 patients a week. I'm specializing in addiction and codependency. I'm running codependency groups. And during that time, my husband relapses. And I thought to myself, okay, if I have the education, the experience, 20 years of Al-Anon, all of this, support, and I'm struggling, then the average person will not know what to do. And it's really overwhelming. And I've seen it with clients for years. People don't know what to do when they're in that crisis. And I thought, I just need to write a book because it was hard enough for me and I had all the skills. And so it's just a really difficult thing. And that's just when you're with someone who's a substance abuser. And we'll get into that. Not all codependency happens when you're in a relationship with a substance abuser. That was the beginning of the definition in the 50s.
Wow.
But yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, very interesting. No, I mean, when we try and define codependency, what are we really, what's the basic level of it?
I know. Colton, I thought you were going to ask this. And it's so funny because when it first came out, it was really when Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob created AA in 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous. And then what happened is his wife, Lois, was asked to do a chapter to wives. And this whole idea of a support group for partners of alcoholics began. And that's what my exploration or research says the beginning of this word codependency started in like the 50s with the AA movement. And the early definition was really you're a partner of an alcoholic. That was like one of the first definitions. And now, if you look up the definition of codependency, you're going to find 30 different definitions or more. My definition, which is really general, which almost takes the co out of codependency, is it's the inability to be your true self, which sounds so general, but codependent behavior is driven from fear. And it's really fear of what someone else is doing, thinking, saying, or how they're behaving or feeling. So say, for example, when you're a kid, if you grow up in an environment with, say, an angry dad, right? The child is going to learn to kind of mediate or figure out how to behave so they're not going to be upset. That's kind of just a general illustration of how it begins. So you learn that I need to change my behavior to be safe and to be okay. But it's weird because the delusion is, and part of the myth is that codependency is really about fixing someone else. And so that was the early definition. I need to change my behavior. I'm not causing this addiction, but I'm contributing to it. And really, it's not that, because first of all, you don't change anyone else or fix anyone else. And it's not really about the other person. It's that I can't tolerate what's happening over in my system while this person is experiencing what they're experiencing. So, for example, if I'm in a marriage and I feel like I need to people please because my husband is going to get upset, I say to myself, I'm doing that because I don't want him to get upset. But really, it's because I don't want to feel my feelings about him getting upset. So it's really not about the other person. It's about us, which is really the lack of clarity around it.
Yeah, it always seems like we see it portrayed as, like the relationship where you're like, oh, these two are very codependent.
Yes.
And not like, when you said a son that has an abusive father, I had never considered that, because you're like, oh yeah, you're like definitely moderating the way the child is behaving because they don't want it like their father to be upset with them again.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's really where these relational paradigms begin, right? So the earliest, I just met with someone earlier today, right? And she is in her 50s and she was in a group I ran a while ago. And she has an almost 80-year-old mother. And her mother calls her every day and she can't be honest with her. Now think about that. She's in her 50s. Her mother's 80. Her mother is still calling her and criticizing her, doesn't listen to her. And yet this person is still behaving like she's 5 years old, because all these things happened when she was really little and her mother scared her. And I keep reminding her, you're a 55-year-old woman now. This woman is 80, and yet you're still behaving like she's going to punish you in some way. But those relational paradigms are so powerful from when they begin. So they can manifest in any relationship, like that example with an elderly parent, or like I saw a lot of parents with their kids who had problems and they would be codependent with their children. So they'd think they needed to save them or send them to treatment or refinance their house for the third time to send them to treatment or give them money. And again, the delusion is that's helping. And I put it in quotes. And what it's really doing is delaying the inevitable, and it's harming both people. So not only does it not help the other person, but it affects both of the people in a negative way.
Yeah, it seems like something you can't plant a seed early and then those roots run really deep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And really, like I said, it's based in fear. I mean, another example I can give, because people are, like you're saying, it is in relationship ultimately. And parents with kids is another dynamic. So I got together recently with my son's 22, and a friend of his mom called me to get together with me, and we met for coffee. And she was still calling her son in the morning at college to wake him up. Now, That is a codependent behavior. Her fear of her son failing in college is directing her behavior. And is that helping the son that's 19 years old? Absolutely not. Is it helping him to grow up? No. What it's doing is ameliorate the mother's fear. But again, it just causes her anxiety and the kid to not grow up. I'm kind of all over the place with examples, but it's because it can be in so many relational dynamics.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, you gave a very general, and you had said, like, this is a very general description, but it seems to be extremely broad. And that
Yeah.
probably feeds some of the like misconceptions that of what
Yes.
codependency is.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's interesting. There, like I said, it began with this kind of relationship with an alcoholic. And then, kind of during the 70s and 80s, there was this movement of, I don't know if you've ever heard of ACOA, which is Adult Children of Alcoholics. And that became this whole movement in like the 80s and 90s with all these authors, John Bradshaw, who was on Channel 2 doing these seminars on the dysfunctional family. There was Claudia Black. There was Melody Beattie, who wrote Codependent No More. That was one of the early, really, I mean, that book is still recommended at most treatment centers. She like it changed the world in seeing codependency. So over the years, it's kind of evolved. And then adult children of alcoholics just became adult children, meaning you don't necessarily have to grow up in an addictive household. You can grow up in a household where the mother's depressed or the father's enraged or the mother's at work all the time. Like, it doesn't really matter if there's an addiction or not. What matters is the really easy description of a dysfunctional home is you don't hear anything, you don't see anything, and you don't say anything. Meaning you live in a fantasy land of denial and like nothing is going on. And that's really the kind of quintessential component of an addictive family, but it's also a definition of any other dysfunctional home. You know, our feelings aren't being validated. If you speak up, Dad, you're drunk. No, I'm not. I mean, that's kind of the classic example, right? And so the kid starts doubting their reality. Wow, I said to Dad he was drunk and I thought he was, but he's telling me I'm not. So one of the first symptoms of someone that grows up in dysfunction is they don't know what normal is. Because what is normal? I mean, that's a whole other episode, right? Yeah. What is normal in a family? It's different for everybody.
Well, and where do we like have to draw the line in here? Like, where does something become codependent? Because otherwise, I imagine this is like everybody, like everybody's in the category.
It's so funny because you're absolutely right. And what I say is it's on a spectrum, right? So at one end of the spectrum, I'll have, say, a new mother come in. So she's got a 2-year-old child and she's severely anxious. And she tells me, I just left my baby with my husband for the first time. Now the baby's 2. So that to me that's like, okay, so you might have a lot of fear about letting go. So that I would say is on one extreme of codependency. So a new mom getting anxious with her kids. On the other end, like I said previously, is maybe these 75-year-old parents that I see that have remortgaged their house 3 times. They've sent their kid to treatment 8 times. They're going broke. Their kid has been in and out of jail. They let them come home all the time, and they're physically compromised. They're getting, physically ill, which happens. So, I mean, and everything in between. I really think it can be in all kinds of relationships. I mean, I've had clients who are codependent with their bosses. They can't set a boundary. They stay there till 8:00 at night. They start getting ill. They neglect their families. That's codependency too. So it's really where you're compromising yourself at the expense of this relationship that you believe is about, helping this other person, but really it's not.
Is this kind of where people get stuck in that headspace where they're like, I could change this thing or this person. Like I can help my child not have an addiction problem, or I can help so that my job doesn't suck quite so much.
Oh, Colton. Hello. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the delusion too. It's like, and it's funny because when people come in and they quit drinking or drugging, I always know when someone's going to start getting better when the following happens. When they realize it's not about blaming everybody else or saying I lost my job because of this boss was crappy or I did this because of this. They start really owning that they're responsible for their life. And it's not that horrible things don't happen to people, because horrible things do happen to us. But the question is, am I going to still be enraged the rest of my life at that person? They give that saying about, drinking is like drinking the poison and expecting someone else to die. Like that's what they talk about. Alcoholism, I'm drinking at that person, but meanwhile, you're like ruining yourself and you think you're torturing someone else. It's the same dynamic. It's like, we're blaming these other people, wishing they would change. And yet you could wait for your entire life for someone to change. It's really about us changing. So that's a great point.
Well, and it sounds like from what you've said, it's a lot of fear based because you're like, I'm
Yes.
afraid of, what if I don't have this person or this thing, or what if it doesn't change? Like, I can't deal with that. And so they just start to be like, well, I can change it. Like that's now they're just I can do it for sure.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. I mean, it's much easier to think that you can change it rather than, in fact, going back to this example of this woman earlier I saw today. A lot of times she says when she gets off the phone, she starts saying to herself, "Oh, why didn't I know that she was going to do that? I'm so dumb." Like she starts attacking herself. And the thing is, I told her, it's much easier for you to attack yourself than it is to feel the rage at your mother, because that's going to be much more difficult. That means there might be a consequence. You may actually want to detach from her. You may have to set some limits with her. You may have to, express, wow, you're hurting my feelings. And all those things are scary to people. So to think that I can change them or I can fix them in some way, or I'll behave in this way so they won't get mad, that feels more like they can control it rather than realize that they have no control. And control is huge in codependency. Because what is control? Control is a response to fear. So going back to, fear being the source of the behavior. So if I'm afraid of my kid getting a D in science in 9th grade, what am I going to do? I'm going to tell them, we're going to stay up all night and I'm going to study with you, rather than say, honey, if you get a D, then you're not going to be able to have your computer, or whatever the consequence is. It's like the parent thinks, I'll make it happen. I'll force them to get a better grade, rather than, again, separating and saying to your child, you're just going to have a consequence if this doesn't happen. Harder.
Well, and it seems like there is, if you think about, what you had said, where they were like, oh, why didn't I know this was going to happen? Like,
Yes.
One of these questions you'd have to ask yourself is, why can't I see the future? Versus the other question at the end of the conversation is like, why did that upset me so much?
Right. Both. I mean, it's so interesting because a huge part of codependency recovery, and this is not just codependency recovery, this is just being a human being. So I call it activation. And basically, activation is getting really mad. And part of being in recovery is looking at, and I say this on my chapter on anger, that was one of the hardest to write, by the way, because most people think their anger is about someone else. So when I try to discern this anger, like it's fine to get angry at someone for, say, at a restaurant giving me the wrong meal. Like I get a little pissed off. But there's a different anger that I call activation, which is really when something old gets activated. So say you're talking to your boss and he kind of isn't listening and is very dismissive of you, and you have this huge rage response. I would say it's really not about the boss. I would say something already in you is getting triggered. So it's really discerning that anger. So then, like you say, the person can take responsibility and own it rather than point the fingers like everybody else is making me angry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we're responsible.
Well, and is that kind of why these, like, there's a lot of hidden ways that you can become codependent and not even realize it's happening to you?
Yes. I mean, that's the tricky thing with codependency too, is that there's many kind of presentations. So someone could be super controlling of their child, or they could be super dominating in their marriage and be really, bossy to their partner. Or someone can be like one of my clients would forget to pick her husband up at the airport. Now, to me, that's just a sign of passive aggressiveness, right? So she would be enraged with her husband because he wouldn't call her while she was home, while he was on vacation. And then she would, quote unquote, forget. So that's this dependency where I can't really say to you that I'm mad at you and I wish you would call, but it's going to come out in some sideways way. And that's really a big part of codependent behavior. We can't literally, and not only can we not say it, but it's almost like we don't even know it's happening. I mean, these behaviors that were developed when we were kids are a way we survived. And I always say that to people, look, these behaviors may not be working for you today, like say a controlling behavior, but they may have worked when you were 5 or 6 or 7 because they were how you survived. The thing is, you're not living with your parents anymore, and those behaviors are still happening. So it's really looking at, geez, how are these not serving me now? A great example is this guy I knew who, when you look at this codependent behavior, sometimes you look at what's the underlying fear. He had a fear of abandonment. So what would he do in relationships? If you have a fear of abandonment and you're in a relationship with a woman, you're going to be controlling and you're going to be fearful about where she is all the time because you think she's going to leave you. And of course, what would ultimately happen? He'd be super controlling and she'd abandon him because it doesn't work, right? So these deep fears of ours keep creating the same situations that no longer work for us.
Yeah. Well, like you said, there seems to be some disconnect in some of these because it might be that guy. And I've known some guys like this who are like, oh, I'm just really afraid she's going to leave me. And I'm like, you're the same guy who 15 minutes ago was telling me how unhappy you are in this relationship. Like, why do you care if she leaves you?
That's such a great example of, and I say this in the book, the past is creating the present, right? And really, when the past creates the present, it creates the future. So this is going to sound crazy, but I believe the past predicts our future. Because if we don't know that, if you don't know that that fear of abandonment is now choosing your partners and you're unhappy in a relationship, but you're scared of ending it, then that's going to predict your future. And that's why I feel so strongly about really looking at what is happening underneath, because otherwise we're going to just continue to do the same things over and expect a different result, right? The definition of insanity.
Right.
And the thing with codependency also, and how it's very similar to addiction, is in addiction, it's a mental illness that tells you you don't have it. So denial is the quintessential component of addiction, right? I can meet with an alcoholic and they're like, oh, I'm not that bad. I only have 6 drinks a day or whatever. Even though their lives are falling apart, they're in denial, which is a cognitive concept. With codependency, it's the same way. Someone could say, she only flirts with guys, once every couple of weeks or whatever, some rationalization of a behavior or a minimizing where it makes it okay. And that's what our cognitions do when we want to keep a behavior going, whether it's an addiction or a codependent behavior, we'll make it okay in our minds. And that's a form of denial.
Well, and that's really weird because it seems like all of these things go incredibly unnoticed by us. Like other people probably see them pretty clearly, but we don't see them happening. And
Right.
that's like some weird disconnect because you're like, well, if I notice it happening, then
Right.
the thing I don't want to change is going to change.
No, it's a great point. It's a great point. I mean, I think just human beings, I mean, part of the recovery from this, well, and it's from addiction too, but from codependency is starting, and this sounds so elementary, but starting to just notice what you're feeling and thinking. Because most of us, like you said before we even got on the air, right? I got to be busy. Well, busyness or addictions or, working 70 hours a week or, overeating or whatever your thing is, keeps us distant from ourselves, right? And addiction and codependency are similar in that way. We're distant from ourselves and distant from others. So recovery is about starting to identify, geez, what am I feeling right now? What am I thinking right now? Because a codependent person will be way more aware of what their partner is thinking and feeling than what they are. So part of our job is to get back in our own bodies. And you're right. I've had people say, oh, I'm not angry. And then we start talking and they're angry about everything. But they don't stop long enough to notice.
Gotcha.
No.
Yeah, it seems like self-protective and self-destructive at the same time, which is just so weird.
It's such a great way to say it, though, because you're right. All these ways of being are how we've chosen to protect ourselves, although we don't know it. But the problem is it doesn't get you what you want, which is healthy relationships, right? Because they're just patterns of behavior. I mean, I'm sure you've heard stories of someone who marries, what's her name? Liz Taylor, who marries like 5 alcoholics in a row. Or, unless we change ourselves, we're going to keep doing it over and over again.
So when we talk, about this very broad scope of codependency, do you think there is like a most nefarious version of it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, again, I think it's on a spectrum, but I think if someone, it's tricky because really what I think the most nefarious version is that if you're shut down emotionally and you're living in denial, you're going to dismiss what you think and feel, right? And you're going to be totally preoccupied on someone else. And that's really what codependency is. I'm much more worried about my partner or my children or my parents than I am myself. And the problem is when you dismiss your needs over a long period of time, it's going to come out somewhere. Either you're going to get physically ill, or you're going to get depressed, or you're going to get suicidal, or you're going to start having panic attacks, or you're going to start getting migraines. So the whole idea of like being detached from self, it comes out somewhere. Obviously, an extreme example would be someone who's in like in an abusive alcoholic marriage, or in a marriage where they're just very financially dependent on someone and they're tolerating behavior over time and they don't see a way out. But any relationship where you don't have a voice and you're dismissing yourself is codependent. And it's, again, I think you're right when you say it so easily happens, because I do think human beings, we're convenient junkies and we want to feel good. I say in my book, all of us in recovery want to be 72 and sunny all the time. And addiction is like that. We're always trying to get to a certain level that's okay. But human beings are similar. Human beings, it's like the pleasure pain principle, right? We don't want to be in pain and we want to experience pleasure. So when things start to get too uncomfortable, we avoid it rather than embracing it and getting through it. How many people do you know? I know so many people that are in marriages or in relationships and they'll say, oh, I could never say that. And I'm like, well, if you're in a relationship where you feel like you guys are really close, wouldn't you be able to share your thoughts and feelings? But it blows my mind how many people don't. And I think that's kind of an example too. People just staying in things for a long period of time that aren't working. I mean, I'm sure you know people like that, right?
Yeah, of course. And
Yeah.
what a colossal red flag that you're like, you literally can't use part of your vocabulary around this person.
Oh,
And we've met those people that are just like, no, I couldn't. And you're like, why? Why can't you?
I know. And it's so sad. And like, again, I think what it is it's just this rationalization. Oh, well, I just can't talk about X. But then if you look at something over time, X has become X, Y, Z, and ABC that we can't talk about. And then the thing is, when you get reinforced that not talking about it kind of makes it okay, then that reinforces that I'm just not going to talk about other things as well.
Well, and I was certainly like, as you were talking about this, and you're like, they get stressed, they get depressed, they get physically ill, all these things. I'm like, I'm sure a lot of people have recognized some of these symptoms by now. And I started to think, I think the most nefarious version that I can think of is the people who kind of chameleon defense that out, where they're like, I know I have a problem and I know it's causing me physical harm, but I also know if other people see that, they're going to bring it up or change it or do something about it. So I'm going to hide that on top of the stress I already have.
Yes. Yes. And that's really great because in a way that makes me think of like, if I'm hiding something, like let's say it's an addiction, if I'm hiding something and I can't talk about that, I'm suffering, then I'm going to have someone codependent in my world that keeps that going. Because also, if you're in a relationship with someone that seems like they're not sharing with you and not, you would think you'd say something because the other person has a right to say, hey, what's going on with you? I mean, you're either feeling connected or you're not. And it's so funny because really the definition of intimacy is that you're sharing your truth with another human being. And yet I know plenty of couples that don't necessarily share what they're thinking and feeling. They talk about stuff like their jobs or kids or whatever, but they're not necessarily doing that work where they really get to know each other. My parents were married for 42 years, and I don't think they knew each other that well. I mean, that could be the generation, but yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Human relationships are tricky. But I do think the only chance at healing is to say your truth. It's not, I always say this is the thing. If you avoid telling the truth, that's just going to grow and grow and grow, right? And it's going to get more and more uncomfortable. If you share something, it's going to be uncomfortable briefly, but then it's going to be great. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you've shared something with someone close to you and you always feel better, even if it's something hard. There's a relief, there's an energy release. And yet people are so scared to share that,
Yeah, I was just thinking about a conversation I had with a buddy of mine, and he like sat down with our group, and I won't share his secret,
Yes,
but
right.
he like told us like he was very concerned about it, and we're like, man, this must be really bad because like you're pretty open with us and you're really drawing out this explanation. And then when he finally said what it was, we all kind of laughed because we're like, that's it. Like that's
Yeah,
all, that's what you were worried about.
right. Right. But think about how tortured he is. I mean, that's the other thing, that whole thing that we talk about around making up stories. I mean, that's the human condition also, right? It's really funny because I just got a great example of this is I got an email on Monday. I had a business meeting over the weekend and I get this email on Monday and it was this apology email from this person. And literally it was like a paragraph of like, I'm so sorry. I talked over you. And literally, Colton, nothing. Didn't have that experience, thought she was lovely. And it just reminds me of, like we can make up stories about anything. And then the problem is we put them on another person. I mean, thank God we had a relationship where I could say, oh, no, that's, it's called a reality check. But you think about how often humans make stuff up in their head and that react to it. Do you know what I mean? You make up that someone is thinking something and then you behave in a way towards that person and it never even happened.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the human condition as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this like the fake narrative. I think we've all had that argument in
Yes.
our head where you're like, oh man, when they come over here and they say this thing, I've got the perfect response. I already know how this argument's going to go. And you're like, that confrontation never happens
Never
because the
happened.
other person doesn't even think it's an issue.
Right. I mean, that's why communication is just so important because we can, again, I've kind of since sobriety studied as using the term loosely, but read about Buddhism and meditation and stuff and done that practice on and off for years. And the benefit of that, which helps codependency, is just sitting with yourself and having a relationship with your thinking because your thoughts are just thoughts and most of them are automatic, right? Most of them are not these beautiful creations of creativity, although some of them are. But most of them are just this automatic thinking from the past. And if you don't know that most of those are just fantasy or lies, you're going to be tortured.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, having a spacious relationship with your thoughts are like a huge deal and a huge thing to practice.
Yeah, I don't know why it's like the thing that's been stuck in my head, I'm sure for a decade or more, is that I heard someone once say, intimacy is into me, I see. And
Ooh,
I was like, that's really good.
that is good. That is good. But you're right. It means that someone really sees who you are, right? The trouble with communication is often, and you've been in a disagreement with someone will come home and say, the partner will say, hey, you were late. And they'll say, hey, I didn't mean to be late. And immediately get defensive rather than say, you're right. I was late and I apologize. It's like most fights or discussions escalate so quickly because someone feels like they need to be defensive rather than just acknowledging and validating someone's experience.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and there's this thought that you're like, oh, but if I acknowledge that I was late, they're not going to let go of the fact that I was late.
right. It's interesting. So if I say the truth, then somehow they're going to end up even double down, escalating. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that's kind of this thinking what creates the escalating communication.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems, like there's like a teeter-tottering scale on this where you're like, the more apparent it is to other people, the more invisible it's going to be to me. Whereas if I'm fully aware of it, like other people may not see it at all.
Yes. Interesting. Yes.
Because we're kind of talking like if you cover it up, like you're fully aware. You're fully aware you have an issue and other people don't see it at all. But if you're like, you don't even know you have an issue, other people are like glaringly seeing that, like, oh, wow, is that going on?
That's a really great point. And the trouble with, repressing something and holding it back and knowing it's going on and hiding it is that takes up a lot of energy. And that gets in the way between you and the people in your life. If you have a secret or you're always trying to hide something, you can't possibly have intimacy. How do you have intimacy with people if you're not willing to be who you are?
Very much. Well, and there's the other side of this, which is like, it's really hard to see somebody you care about, right? Like going through this. And it can be very easy to see it with that outsider perspective where you're like, wow, that is immediately noticeable.
Yes.
But you also like can't necessarily get involved, when it's not your situation.
That's a great point. And this is what I would say. So this is almost like the definition of codependency, right? Because you're saying to me, so say I see someone that has this problem. All right, we'll say it's an addiction. All right, say I'm married to someone who has an addiction, or my best friend has an addiction. And yet I feel like, oh, they need to figure that out. I can't, if I just say to them, hey, you have an addiction, you need help, then they're just going to get defensive and walk away. The thing is you can share your experience. So it's much different for someone to say to their wife, you're driving me crazy. You drink too much. You need to go to treat, blah, blah, blah. That, and honey, I love you. I'm feeling really distant from you. It seems like when you're drinking, we can't connect. Like if you just own kind of how you experience the person with the problems, they're much more open to hearing it. So you're right. It's like part of it is like, oh, I can't get involved. But at the same time, if that relationship is affecting you, you have a right to share how you feel about it. You may not be able to control their behavior, which is the codependent thing, but you can share your experience. And that really is helpful because, when someone hears, that's what interventions are based on, right? Interventions are not a lot of feelings. They're basically just facts. Interventions are saying, Mom, when I was in 7th grade, you forgot to pick me up at the football game because you were drinking and I had to sit there for 3 hours. You're just saying facts of how their drinking affected you, but you're not blaming. And there is something about that where the person doesn't get defensive, where you get to kind of the underlying feelings, which is what impacts someone.
And there's a quote in your book that really highlights this that I thought was really good, which was there's two kinds of business, my business and not my business. And so you're like, the part that that I directly have a role in, like that's my business. The rest of it, I cannot, that's their business. That's not mine.
I know. It's so hard for people to get that too. It's like, I'm only responsible for what comes out of my mouth and what I do. And I'm not responsible for what comes out of their mouth. And yet things can feel very personal, but really they're not. If my 80-year-old mother is criticizing me, it's about her unhappiness. It's not about me, but it affects me. And I might have to set a limit, but it feels personal, but it's really not. Because why would someone do that unless they had issues? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and there's that, it feels really bad, right? If you try and reach out to somebody that you're like, oh, I can see you have this issue and I want to help, but you reach out and they're like, they're not ready for that. Or, it's not your place to step in and it doesn't get better. It kind of leaves you feeling a bit depressed as well. Because you're like, oh, wow, I really failed to help somebody that I care about.
Oh my God, Colton, that's such a great point. And you're right in the sense of, you may want to help a loved one and they may not be ready. And really, when you do an intervention, it's interesting because ultimately it's not really about the person getting sober. It's really about the family being able to let go. So when you set a limit and you say, geez, your drinking is really bothering me, or whatever the behavior is, it's this opportunity to what we call detach with love, where then you can say to the person, okay, well, if you're not willing to quit drinking, then I'm going to only be able to call you in the morning. I can't call you at night or whatever. It's this opportunity to set a limit. But also, you're right. The problem with it is then you have to feel the grief and sadness about the limitations of that relationship that you may not have wanted to acknowledge before that. Right?
Yeah.
Because you're right. To admit that you can't save anyone or change their behavior, you can only be supportive is a hard thing for people to accept. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's a bummer, but I think it's very hard to accept, right? This is that denial, kind of superimposed on yourself where you're like, I can't change them. And it's like, well, factually speaking, you can't change them. That's just true. You don't have to be upset about that. You just can't do that.
Right. And the thing is that if you change, and this is the codependent part, if I change my behavior, they have a much better chance of changing their behavior. Again, the classic example is, say someone finally says to their husband, I can't take your drinking anymore. You need to move out. Oftentimes that leads someone to treatment because they don't want to move out, right? So when someone has a consequence for a behavior, it's definitely more motivating than if I don't do anything. So sometimes setting a limit really does help.
Certainly.
It sounds counterintuitive, but sorry.
No, I mean, I think you're right because you're like, this person's going to care about me less if I set this hard limit with them. And in
Right.
reality, like that might be the moment that they wake up to what's happening.
That's right. And that's why this stuff is so tricky, especially with parents and kids, because of course the parents' biggest fear is something's going to happen to their kid. So, Sarah, how can you tell me to ask them to leave? What happened? They might die. Well, you're right. But they might die. They might overdose in your basement also. Do you know what I mean? You're not keeping them clean and sober. They are. It's really not about what you're doing, but it's so tricky because you really have to accept the possibility of the loss, whether it's someone just moving out or, something horrible happening. You're absolutely right.
Like
Go
I
ahead.
kind of need a scale of like what's worst case scenario and what's most likely scenario.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, over time, it's funny because in the New York Times, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, there was this article about really disparaging the word codependency. And some people really believe that it's victim blaming, that you're kind of blaming the spouse for their husband's alcoholism, say. And the thing that they missed was it's really not about that. It's saving the life of the spouse. Because the problem is, if you continue to be in a marriage where you're not getting any needs met and they get sicker and sicker, you're not helping yourself. So it's like no one's being blamed, but you might as well at least save one life. Hopefully, you'll save two by your behavior, but otherwise, both people are going down.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Well, and there's kind of this like illusion of safety, right? Protecting your spouse, protecting your kids. You're like, well, I've got to protect, all of these things. When in
Yes.
reality, like if you set that hard boundary, what might happen, and we had somebody on the show talk about this, their
Yes.
spouse went to recovery and their spouse was an
Yes.
alcoholic for a very long time.
Yes.
And going through recovery, they found out like, oh, you've been cheating on me every week for the last 10 years of our marriage. And it's like you were kind of keeping yourself in a even worse situation by not setting these boundaries and not figuring out what was going on just because it seems safe.
Yes. That whole delusion kills me too. Like over the years and being in practice, I've had so many people say we're staying together for the kids. And that always pushes my buttons because I don't believe it. You're staying together because you're afraid to do something different. To me, kids much prefer if parents are present and happy. I mean, is it better to have two parents arguing for 20 years while they keep while they keep the house together rather than separate and have people actually live happier lives? I mean, again, people don't want to look at that. I'm afraid to change. And that's just a rationalization to me. You're
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Well, and I think
Yeah.
I saw a study at one point that said like kids are profoundly happier after their parents are divorced because they feel the tension in the relationship as much as everybody else, even if you don't think they do. So then
Yes.
the kid is on edge all the time because they're like, oh, parents are going to fight again. They're going to split up. They're going to do whatever. And
Absolutely.
it's like, once it's happened, they're like, oh, okay, this is ripping the band aid off moment. Like everything's fine. It was just scary.
Yes, absolutely. I totally, totally agree. I mean, that tension, I've had so many, oh my gosh, it's just alcoholism is such a delusional disease. I mean, I would know, but I've had so many moms say, oh, my kids didn't know I drank. They like to believe that. But the fact is, kids 5 or 6 years old can recognize mom being a little loopy. I mean, but a lot of mothers say that because it's very painful to admit that you're an alcoholic mother. I mean, that's a whole other episode, but kids do know. And even if you drank when they went to bed, you may not be present in the morning because you're hungover. So it's not only when you're drinking. The thing is, you could be thinking about drinking all afternoon. So you're not actually present. It's a tough one. It's a tough one for people to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
some of this, like, the way you don't see behavior in yourself, or, other people do see it in you, kind of has this like play in, modern society. Everybody is feeling like extremely burned out, but they
Yes.
won't acknowledge that that's happening.
Yes.
And you actually had a pretty incredible story where you're like, oh, this is what burnout is. I'm experiencing it right now.
Right. I mean, I definitely crashed and burned, which is kind of the classic ending for someone who's codependent. I mean, I had a practice of, again, full-time seeing patients. I had a child. Then my husband relapses. And that was pretty much it for me. That kind of put me over the edge. And I do think that happens a lot with people who are focused on fixing someone else. I think it happens a lot with mothers. It probably happens a lot with people who have jobs like nurses, people that are caretakers, but also it can happen with anybody who's just neglecting themselves and focused on others. And again, it feels so kind of natural or like you have no choice. But a lot of people, that's kind of the moment of truth. I mean, the crash and burn. I mean, I literally, and I'm not kidding, barely could get out of bed for like 2 weeks. And it wasn't like I was sick. It was like my system just crashed. That's really the sign, right? Oh, geez, I think I should start taking care of myself. And I mean, codependency it's so much trickier than addiction, because when you're an addict, I mean, I knew, okay, I had to quit cocaine and alcohol because my life was blowing up, and you put down the substances. But codependency is much trickier. People will say, well, what do I need to do? And it's like, less. That's the answer. Because codependent people are usually way over functioning. They're usually doing way too much. They're usually in everybody else's business. They're the examples are different mother clients I've had that sign up for every, board, or, the teacher will say, hey, will someone be the head of this? And they'll say yes, and they'll end up having like way too much going on. And it is kind of this, we believe we have to say yes, but really the beginning is, the first tool in the book is self-care. And I give that example with my best friend who went to the therapy office and her husband was the alcoholic. And the therapist was talking to him. And then she kept saying to him, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And the therapist just finally said, you just need to rest, because you just need to focus on you rather than everybody else.
Yeah.
And again, the delusion is she's believing she's helping, but she's not. Right.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like, if you start weighing things against the thing you don't want to do, like you probably, that's maybe a moment where you're like, oh, I'd rather crash my car than go to work today.
Yes.
Like, hey, you might have some burnout going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think I give that example of when I had the breast cancer and I would rather go to radiation than go to work. That was a clear sign. Yeah. And part of me even believes, and I don't know, everybody's got their thoughts about illness origins, but I really believe I've been fine since then. And I mean, who knows what will happen, but I do believe, do you know Gabor Mate? He's this guy he's written, his most recent book is called The Myth of Normal. And he's a big trauma person and PTSD. His first book was on addiction, basically. But anyways, his second book was called When the Body Says No. And it's literally all about codependency. It's all about the connection between codependency and physical illness. And he's a physician, and he gives these examples of these clients of his who either couldn't speak up to their mothers or whatever the scenario, and they would get sick. And I really believe that when we dismiss our own needs and wants for an extended period of time, physical illness isn't far away. So, yeah, I mean, that was a clear sign that it was time to leave my practice.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and anyone that hears that and thinks like, well, I don't know that your mental state causes an illness, like I would point directly to the extremely well-known placebo effect, where you're
Thank
like,
you.
I can tell you something's going to get better and your brain will make it better without me actually doing anything. So it's clearly very strong already.
You're brilliant. Yes. Do you know Joe Dispenza? Have you ever read any of his stuff? Oh, I keep throwing these things. I'm old. He's a guy that wrote the book on a placebo effect and gives all these research studies. And his whole thing is meditation and healing physical illness through meditation, and has some amazing things on his website. But you're absolutely right. Our minds and our thoughts can, like Gabor Mate describes literally what happens in the body, the cortisol spikes and the depletions and all that stuff. So yeah, it's maybe not a cause and effect, but there's a correlation. Absolutely. Yeah.
You're like, we can certainly see something going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, it makes sense. If you're kind of in this codependent realm, you neglect yourself. And if you neglect yourself, what's going to ultimately happen? You avoid going to the doctor. You avoid going to the dentist. You don't eat right. You don't sleep right. Ultimately, something's going to happen. So it's not like a huge mystery, right?
Well, and I'm sure by now we've at least scared somebody to be like, okay, I think I have you guys have brought up all these red flags, and I think I have these red flags. What are the things they do going forward?
Yeah. All right. I would say some tools are this. The beginning is to try to pull yourself back a little bit from the quote unquote crisis or person or situation you think you're saving, and start to notice what is happening in your own body. So, I give the tool at the end of each chapter. Can you just sit still and notice your thoughts and what's happening in your body for 5 minutes? And that sounds so simple, but most people who are codependent don't have any idea what they're feeling. They can tell you what their kid is feeling or their husband is feeling or their boss is feeling, but they typically don't know what they're feeling. So just starting to check in with yourself. Some people I know set their watches like once an hour to go off. Geez, check in. Start getting used to, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? Because again, someone may not even know they're angry, but everybody around them knows they're angry. But if they stop long enough, oh my gosh, I feel a little angry. So start to notice your thoughts and feelings. The other thing is, and I know this is hard, try speaking up a little, because not speaking up and having a voice is a huge component of negative consequences. So I think I give the example in the book, like even if it's the girl at the Dunkin' Donuts or the coffee shop and they give you your coffee and it's not right, just try to say to her, could I have this? She's someone that you don't have a deep connection with. Can you try to practice with people that are easier? To try to speak up for your needs, because typically codependent people, again, don't know their feelings, but also don't know their needs. Can't even identify. I have people say, I don't even know what my needs are. Well, there's a list that you can actually Google, but it's like relational needs, health needs, feeling appreciated, feeling understood, feeling listened to. I mean, there's so many needs, physical contact. So trying to speak up a little bit, even if it's your partner, just speaking up on things that maybe are less scary, So finding your voice is one of the big tools in healing. Another thing would be try to take some time for yourself. Because again, like we've been talking about, codependent people are busy all the time. I mean, I was telling someone the other day do you have children?
I don't.
Not yet? Okay. So when you have a child, it's your life gets very busy and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And I remember joining this gym and I would go to the gym and put my baby in the childcare, and I literally would go sit in the whirlpool for 90 minutes. I never even worked out because I didn't have babysitting. So that was a way I just got like an hour and a half for myself. So one thing that's so important is to try to get little chunks of time for yourself. Key. And there's so many other things. Another thing would be very often people who are codependent are super busy taking care of everyone else, but they lose their own connections. They've lost friends. They're not sharing their truth with anyone. So who are you connected with? Who do you feel listens to you and validates you, if anyone? If you don't have someone, think of some support groups, whether it's, online or not online, or what are your interests? I mean, obviously Al-Anon and CODA and all of those groups are part that someone could join. ACOA is a great group. But even if it's something just of a personal interest, something where you can feel connected to other people is really key.
Well, and it seems like this is the part where people start lying to themselves about getting better, where they're like, okay, I have the list, right? I've made a list in my mind that I'm going to, start thinking about, mental check-ins more and the things I need to do. And then they just forget.
Right.
Which is like, it's very human. That's the thing we all do, is we're like, log that in the brain and then we forget about it. So it's like, write the list down. Now you need to set an alarm that once a day tells you to look at the list you already wrote so that you can remember that you're supposed to be doing these things.
Well, and the thing is that if these things are neglected, ultimately, like I always say, it's going to come out somewhere. You're either going to start getting into fights with your spouse all the time, or you're going to start being really negative at work, or you're going to start getting depressed and you're going to think, I got to make an appointment with a psychiatrist. I need a medication. Or you're going to start eating tons of sugar. Like, again, it's going to come out somewhere. So these are tools to start thinking about before you get into like the danger zone. I mean, when that happened to me, I literally took a picture of this. I took an online questionnaire on, are you stressed? And it literally said, you're in the danger zone. So I think that's the trouble. We get so used to feeling amped up and feeling anxious that we don't even know it's affecting us negatively. And it really is. So but again, that goes back to trying to take time for yourself. You don't notice how you're feeling if you're not spending any time with yourself, right?
Yeah, very true. Very true. Sarah, this has been awesome.
Oh my God, I hope so. I mean, I know it's hard stuff. I mean, there's so many tools. And like we were talking about before, my website is drsarahmichaud.com, and there's podcasts on there. Yours will be on there, where I talk about this stuff. There's also a YouTube channel, Leaving Crazy Town, where we talk about specific topics like anger or fear or communication or dismissing your needs or whatever. So educating yourself is definitely part of it, because then you start seeing yourself in other people and you're like, oh, I'm that way. Oh, there's a solution. Great. Yeah.
Certainly. Well, and plug your book for sure, because it's such a good read. I really think people should pick it up, read it.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So my book is called Co-Crazy. And the reason it's called that is because when clients come in and they're hitting a bottom in codependency, you feel crazy. And how many people listening to this podcast have had the experience where you're in a relationship and you're like, I'm feeling crazy. Like, am I crazy? That's the word that people would use. And you know what it really means is that you're having a lot of feelings. Because I think when people get overwhelmed with feelings, they feel crazy if they're not used to it. So it's called Co-Crazy. You can get it on Amazon or my website, and definitely check it out. Yeah. And you can email me if you have questions, or I do groups every 8 weeks or so. So if you're interested in a group, let me know. Yeah.
Yep. Fantastic.
Awesome.
And as I tell people, if you pick up the book, leave a good review on Amazon. That very much helps your authors. If you go and you find Leaving Crazy Town on YouTube, drop a like, leave a single comment that just says like, good, loved it. Like something very simple. It really helps the algorithm for your creators.
Oh, that's a great point. I've got to leave you some because I've been listening to your podcast. I keep forgetting that. And it's so funny because I always forget to say that to people. So thank you for that, Colton. This has been great.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderful.
Absolutely. It's been so fun. And I love your podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know I opened the show calling everyone codependent, but by the end of this episode, you've probably seen a handful of these red flags in yourself. And you're not crazy. You're just out of sync with yourself, like the rest of us. In other news, April is almost at its end, and rankings haven't changed much since last week. Number 1, the United States, now led by New York, California, and Texas. Number 2, England of the United Kingdom. Number 3, Australia, with South Australia rising to the top of a very tight race. Number 4, Canada, with Ontario gaining a healthy lead. And number 5, Ghana, still boxing out Ireland. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend, and I'll see you all back here next week for another new episode. Until the next episode, pretty please do all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Remember, you can reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social medias if you want to reach me personally or if you want to be on the show. But most importantly, stay dumb.